All right, strap in, everyone, because we're going deep into a diplomatic mess today.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like a meeting between President Trump and the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, went from a handshake to a shouting match in record time.
Right.
And Secretary of State Rubio, well, he certainly has thoughts on the whole thing. So
it's interesting that you mentioned all that because those were actually at the heart of this meeting.
Right.
Ukraine has a ton of these resources, these minerals that are crucial for all sorts of advanced technologies. We're talking global power dynamics, economic implications right off the bat.
So high stakes, but things went downhill quickly, right?
Yeah. The meeting started off pretty friendly.
Yeah.
But the whole mood changed when President Zelensky pushed back against Vice President Vance's claim that Trump was using diplomacy to try to secure a deal for those minerals.
Okay. So what was it specifically that Zelensky took issue with?
He pointed to the Russian President Putin's history of breaking ceasefire agreements and refusing prisoner exchanges. Zelensky basically questioned whether diplomacy alone could really work with Putin.
I imagine that didn't go over well.
Not at all. Vance reportedly called Zelensky disrespectful for saying all this, especially with American media there.
Right.
He said that Zelensky should be thanking President Trump for trying to end the conflict, especially with the problems Ukraine is facing maintaining their military. He even accused Zelensky of being ungrateful for the military assistance from the U.S.
So a lot of tension already.
Yeah.
Did things de-escalate?
Actually, they got even worse when President Trump himself jumped in. He told Zelensky that without the U.S., Ukraine had very little leverage.
Wow.
And that he was risking another world war by not taking the deal. He even said, you don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards.
That's
yeah.
That sounds less like a negotiation and more like an ultimatum.
Yeah, it certainly came across that way. President Trump even warned Zelensky that he was gambling with the lives of millions and that his actions were disrespectful to the U.S. for all the support it has given Ukraine.
So much for a friendly meeting. Where does Secretary of State Rubio fit into all this?
Well, both President Trump and Rubio have said publicly that Zelensky should only come back to the White House when he's ready to make peace.
Okay.
Rubio specifically said that avoiding accusations and engaging in negotiations is the only way to end the war.
Right.
He even said, you don't get people to a negotiating table when you're calling them names.
So Rubio's stance seems to be that this is a high-stakes diplomacy and that keeping things civil is crucial to ending the conflict.
Yeah, exactly. He's framing this as a serious international situation that needs a delicate touch.
But of course, an incident like this is going to get reactions internationally.
Right.
What happened after the meeting?
Well, a few European prime ministers and diplomats said they supported Zelensky after that meeting.
Right.
In fact, the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, said the free world needs a new leader while supporting Zelensky and his country.
It sounds like a pretty direct criticism of how the meeting went. How did Rubio respond to that?
He basically said that the EU doesn't have a plan to end the conflict and that President Trump is the only one actively trying to. He even argued that people should be supporting President Trump's efforts.
So Rubio is on Team Trump here. But we can't forget about Zelensky. How did he respond to all this after this very public disagreement?
He gave an interview on Fox News where he said he wouldn't apologize for what he said during the meeting.
Okay.
But he did say that the argument wasn't good for either country. He said that he respects President Trump and America, but that he just couldn't change his country's attitude toward Russia.
That makes sense. It's not like he can just erase years of history and conflict just like that.
Right. And this situation shows how complicated international relations can be. It's a constant balancing act, especially for a country like Ukraine that's trying to keep a relationship with a powerful country like the U.S. while also dealing with an aggressive neighbor like Russia.
It sounds like Zelensky is walking a tightrope. Any misstep could have serious consequences.
Yeah.
Speaking of consequences, what kind of ramifications could this Oval Office blow-up have?
Well, in the short term, it could damage the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine.
Right.
There's already been talk of a cooling of diplomatic ties and possible impacts on military aid.
What about the long term?
That's where things get even more worrying. This whole thing could embolden Russia, potentially leading to more aggression in the region. And it also weakens the idea of a united front against Russia, which could have global implications.
So this wasn't just an argument. It could have real-world consequences for a lot of people.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, what are the possible ways forward from here?
Yeah, is there any hope for things to calm down, or are things just going to keep getting worse? What are the experts saying?
Some analysts think that quiet diplomacy is the best way to go now.
Okay.
Try to smooth things over behind the scenes and get everyone back to the negotiating table.
But is that even realistic after such a public and heated argument? It's not like everyone can just pretend it didn't happen.
It definitely won't be easy,
Right.
but it's probably the most practical way to go. The other option is a complete breakdown in relations, which wouldn't help anyone, especially the people stuck in the middle of this conflict.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in all the drama. But at the end of the day, this is about people's lives and the future of a country.
Yeah, and that's why it's important to approach these situations with a deep understanding of all the complexities. It's not as simple as good guys versus bad guys.
Yeah.
Everyone has their own motivations, their own history, their own interests.
So where does that leave us? What can we, as people trying to make sense of this situation, take away from all this?
I think this situation is a perfect example of why critical thinking is so important. We need to be careful of simple stories and easy answers. The world is complicated, and we can't just believe the headlines.
So basically, don't just skim the surface.
Yeah.
Dig a little deeper.
Right. Consider different points of view, look at different sources, and try to understand the nuances of the situation. International relations are rarely black and white.
It's fascinating, but also a little overwhelming to think about.
It's true. And in this particular case, the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
The future of Ukraine, the stability of the region, and even the global balance of power could all be affected by what happens next.
So what should we be paying attention to in the coming days and weeks? What are the signs that things are getting better or worse?
I'd say keep an eye on the rhetoric coming from both Washington and Kyiv. Is it conciliatory or confrontational?
Right.
Are there any signs of back-channel diplomacy or a willingness to compromise? Look for any hints that the tension is easing.
So we're looking for signs that the relationship is warming up.
Right.
What about Russia? What role do they play in all of this?
That's a crucial point. Pay attention to what Russia is doing.
Yeah.
Are they trying to take advantage of this rift between the U.S. and Ukraine? Are they escalating their military presence or doing anything provocative?
So we need to be watching all the players involved, not just the U.S. and Ukraine.
Exactly. International relations are all connected, and events like this can affect everything.
This has been a really helpful conversation. I feel like I understand the situation a lot better now. It's not just about one meeting. It's about the bigger picture, the history, and what could happen.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
It's important to think about these things even when they feel overwhelming or confusing.
Right.
The more we know about the world, the better we can make sense of it and have good conversations about it.
So what's the main takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about after hearing all this?
I think the big question here is, how do you balance the need for strong alliances with respecting each country's independence and different opinions?
That's a tough one. There's no easy answer.
You're right, but it's a question worth thinking about, especially in a world where everything's connected and the risks of conflict are so high.
You really left us with something to think about.
It's not about giving all the answers,
Right.
but about getting people to think and understand more about the world we live in.
Well said. This deep dive has given me a lot to think about.
Right.
I have a feeling we'll be talking about this story again as things develop.
I agree. This situation will probably keep going for a while, and it reminds us that even small diplomatic events can have big consequences.
It shows how interconnected global politics really are and how important it is to understand the effects of events like this.
Exactly.
Well, I think we've covered a lot today. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap up?
Stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay curious. The world is a complex and changing place, and it's up to all of us to try to understand it.
It really makes you realize that everything's connected on this global stage. But let's zoom in a bit.
Okay.
We talked about the military aid the U.S. gives to Ukraine. But what does that actually look like?
That's a good question because it's a bit controversial.
Okay.
The U.S. has mostly given Ukraine defensive weapons and money, arguing that it helps keep a balance of power in the region.
So the U.S. is trying to support Ukraine without making Russia angry.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance, and this recent event has made things even more uncertain.
And how does Ukraine feel about all this?
Well, you have to remember that Ukraine's relationship with Russia is really complicated.
Yeah.
They have a long history. But recent events, like when Russia took Crimea in 2014, have made them distrust and fear each other.
So for Zelensky, this isn't just politics. It's about his country's survival.
Exactly. And he's in a tough spot. He needs the U.S.'s help, but he also can't look like he's being controlled by them.
Right.
He has to find his own way of balancing what his people want with the pressure from both sides.
It sounds like there's no easy answer here.
There really isn't, and that's what makes this so interesting and worrying. The decisions made in the next few weeks and months could have big effects, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole world.
This deep dive has really shown me how complicated this is.
Right.
It's easy to just focus on the headlines, but there's so much more going on.
That's why we do these deep dives.
Yeah.
To look deeper and understand more about what's happening in the world.
Well said. This has been really helpful, and I appreciate you taking the time to explain all this to us.
My pleasure. And remember, knowledge is power.
Yeah.
The more we understand, the better choices we can make and have better conversations.
Couldn't agree more. Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.